Awesome. Let's do this. Hello, welcome everyone. So thank you for joining us today for Racial Justice, Safety and Security and Ancestral Healing with Kiah Morris. So looking forward to this chat with her today. And so excited that so many of you joined us. So we have nearly 150 people registered for this webinar today. So excited for the enthusiasm on this topic. What I would love is we're just kind of waiting for people to join is please just type into the chat where you're from and your name, just so that we have an idea of who's here today. And also so that Kiah has an idea of who's here today. Oh, wonderful. Chicago, Colorado, New York City. Vermont, Hawaii, DC, Indianapolis, so fast, going so fast, Portland, Oregon. Wonderful. LA. Great. All right, I'm just gonna go ahead so I can see all the names too. Yes. Andy, Robin, hello. Maya, Bev. Oh, goodness. Jennifer, Dominic, Shayna, Baron. So great to see all of you on today. Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Montreal.
Yeah, oh, Montreal. Fantastic. Oh, great. Yeah, I did see that we had a couple people from Canada registered. Yes, yes, Tamarick. Hello. All right. So Beth was on the call as well. So excited to have all of you guys here today. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes as people come on. And then we're going to go ahead and we'll get started. So excited to have all of you here today. Yeah. Okay. Frida, Arabella, Karna, Manaz, Jane, Maya, Portland, Andy, Joyce, Nancy, yeah. Catherine, Lisa, great, yes, yes. Rosa, Carrie, yes, Ty, Sarah. So great to see so many people on. I know today was a busy day and I got a lot of emails from people on the West Coast who wanted to join and are also had some conflicts with meetings. So I'm glad to see some people were able to join. Layla from Milwaukee, great. So excited. So we're gonna go ahead and get started now. And I just wanna welcome all of you here with us today. And I just wanna start with all of us just taking 3 deep breaths, because I really want to welcome all of you here, but also just want us, I know some of us were running from different places and coming from different meetings, and just want to kind of set the tone and welcome all of us here into this session. So we'll just ask that everyone just take 3 deep breaths with me. So just breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. One more time, in and out. Okay, so thank you for doing it. I even feel better. I'm like, oh. And so for those of you that have been on our webinars in the past, we started these Consciously Secure Leader series and webinars really in response to the pandemic and a lot of questions that people had within our community that didn't directly relate to cybersecurity, but there were other security concerns that people were dealing with. And for us, a lot of the people in our community are what I do call consciously secure leaders. They're aware, they're very conscious about what's going on with their teams, but also with people in their lives. They are true leaders in that way. And they're wanting to take care of and support people within the larger community. And so it started off with someone asking about their children and how to keep their children safe. So we had a webinar around consciously secure parenting. Actually, we had two. It was so popular, we did two of them. But we also had a webinar, the last one, which was focused globally on women and how the pandemic has impacted women globally, which was also a very popular topic. And we've done other ones in between that have focused on cybersecurity in some ways, but then also other topics that haven't and focused on resilient leadership or other things. And so today's topic was also very important, very in line to kind of the pulse of the community and what it is that people were interested in hearing about, but obviously the topic that is just so timely. And for us here at PurePoint, I think it goes without saying that with the wrongful death of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police and the protests in cities around the U.S. and nearly every city in the U.S. and then protests around the world, that we're just faced with a reminder that racism is deeply rooted in the American culture. And part of that, what fuels the work that we do here at PurePoint International, is thinking about how do we create a consciously secure living for people in our lives, but also how do we think about it more broadly, and can we do that for billions of people around the world, focus on safety, security, inclusion, and love. And so I'm just thankful that all of you are here today, that our community of consciously secure leaders, allies, and supporters who we work with, and companies and communities around the world. What we are focused on, particularly with not just PurePoint International, but consciously secure living, is supporting vulnerable populations, underrepresented voices, including people of color and the Black community. And so I'm honored to have Kiah here today to share her voice on this topic of safety and security. And so many of you have heard me speak about safety and security, not just in a way of it being around cybersecurity or digital security or physical security, but I talk about it in terms of psychological security, emotional security, spiritual security, social security. How are we connecting with each other, and how does that impact us? And I think part of that is because as a Black woman, it impacts me so much. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about Kiah and her story is when I speak to her and I hear just the intersection of all of this. And so it's just an honor to have you here today. And what I would like to do is just now switch into really sharing with you all more about Kiah and her background, just so that you know a bit more about her. Kiah lives in Bennington, where she served in the General Assembly as a state representative from 2014 to 2016. And 2016 to 2018 was the first African-American and person of color elected from Bennington County, and the second African-American woman to be elected to the legislature in Vermont history. She's also an award-winning, in-demand trainer, speaker, and presenter, an accomplished artist. She is also the author of a recently published book of poetry called Life Lessons and Lyrical Translations of My Soul. So there's a quote that I love by Kiah, and I'm just gonna share that here, and then I'm gonna hand it over to her to welcome all of us here today. And as we really just kind of get settled for this discussion that we're gonna have tonight on racial justice, safety and security, and the ancestral healing of America. We are in a deeply urgent moment where it is clear that our government is struggling to develop responses to support the very survival of citizens in the midst of a global pandemic. All social safety nets and systems are being tested to their limits, and many of those limits were set by people in elected office, It's crucial that citizens of the United States are well represented by individuals of diverse backgrounds, life experiences, and identities to speak truth to power and to ensure that no one is left behind. So just such powerful words. I love reading that. I love speaking it. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Kiah to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to share space with you. Jessica has been just an incredible friend and just sister in the struggle. And, I look so much to her wisdom as I've been going through my different trials and tribulations. She was one of the first people to call and be like, hey, sis, let's create a plan. How can I help you? I want to make sure your whole self, you are okay. Your family is okay. And how can I use my expertise, my resources to do that? And that's one of the most crucial parts of building any kind of a community, whether it's local or it's global. It's all around how we interact with one another and how we appreciate and honor each other and our struggles. I think before we begin, I wanted to just take a couple moments for a few things that I think are important to state. I want to acknowledge that wherever we are in the world right now, we are standing on ancestral lands that more likely than not have been occupied through colonialism and white supremacy. I currently sit on Abenaki territory, and those are the indigenous people of Vermont and many New England regions. There are several other indigenous tribes that also were based out of this region, and many of which were reclaiming that history. Those communities are just now reclaiming that history. And as we talk about the really deep-rooted and deep-seated pains of the effects of white supremacy culture and white nationalism, colonialism, and imperialism on our nation and on our world, we have to uplift and honor those who were the indigenous of those lands and recognize that everything else begins with that healing there. And until we get that healing correct, until we do right by those we have wronged, we will continue on this cycle of oppression. So I just want to thank all of those who came before us and have made it possible for us to be here. And I want to honor and lift up and bring to your acknowledgement those that were here before us. Also want to give a shout out because it's Pride. And in the midst of so much of this, it's important to note how much pride means for people across the globe, and recognizing that here in the United States, Pride began as an uprising and as a riot that was led by Black trans women. So as much as we want to talk about all of the different intersectionalities of oppression, we must recognize that so much of it is rooted within the bodies of women of color. So thank you for giving me that space, and I really look forward to let's get into it.
Yes, no, and thank you for sharing that. It's such important history, and I think too is in talking about pride, and it's also just important to talk about and to just continue to give voice to the fact that the life expectancy of a Black trans person is 35 years of age, and that continues to be the case if someone is killed. Or due to mental health concerns, and someone maybe takes their own life. And so I just think, so thank you for continuing to give voice to that, and where we are, and of course in this conversation. So as we start this virtual chat with Kiah, there are just a couple of housekeeping things that I want to state. We have Zoe on the call with us. So many of you guys who have been with us for our previous calls, Zoe is here with us. And so she is manning the chat. If you guys have any questions, please put them in there, and she will make sure to let us know that you have questions. There's also a Q&A section, so you can put them in there. If you have any trouble with anything, please just go ahead and contact Zoe directly. She just sent a chat to everyone, so you know her name. And you can just contact her directly, and she'll be able to help you out. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So just last Wednesday, the lynching is now being added to the federal civil rights law after 200 attempts since 1882. And this law is still now, though, is only in the situation if 2 or more people are lynched, not if just one person is lynched. So what does this tell you about institutionalized racism in America?
There is a really important piece of all of this, and recognizing the unwillingness and the inability for those that are holding power to yield power, to hold others accountable for basic human rights violations like the killing of another individual, and not an inability to contextualize the fact that that taking of a life was rooted in a place of hate and is absolutely centered on that person's identity and their space within this continuum of white supremacy. It tells us so much about how our legal system, how our courts, and even how our policies are designed to maintain those systems of power. The fact that this was not passed so long ago meant that there was an exchange made. There was a decision that was finally put, a point that was not going to be crossed by those who have the ability to change laws, that said, we're going to negotiate very human lives and determine who is sacrificial and who is not. Black bodies, brown bodies, indigenous bodies, bodies of color in this country are here rooted in a system of capitalism. And so our very existence, as marginal as it is, so often in so many spaces and spheres, is really rooted in the ability to accumulate, to maintain, and to magnify wealth for a small percentage of a predominantly, overwhelmingly white population. That exchange for money for people is written throughout our history. And that exchange of money for people also means whose lives matter. And so when you need to say that there has to be a group, a mass killing, we need to think of these terms as mass killings. It's the only way that these systems of power are used to and are comfortable with acknowledging a human experience. Because if I just commit a crime against you and there are no witnesses to bear for it, if it is just a singular experience that you as an individual might have, what that's going to do is give me an off-ramp as the person in power to say, but I don't have to believe that what really happened to you actually happened to you. I don't have to acknowledge that there is an entire community connected to that one individual. Because then once there are two, then you have a group. And it's much harder to hide behind ignorance and willful ignorance around saying this person's life did matter and was taken unjustly. What it also tells us, again, as I said, is when we think about this, there is really no justification for why 200 attempts were necessary, that there have been multiple people throughout history coming into these spheres of power and saying, you must do something, and that it continually got shunted away. But it's very often because we get also distracted by other shiny things other than the pieces that we need to hold on to and we need to make most salient. When I think about what this also means when we're saying the fact that there was even a fight over this, even right now, even in this moment, those conversations have, again, everything to do with an unwillingness to actually force accountability on those who choose to harm and to kill, those who choose to make decisions to take a life, those who choose to embody their hatred through the taking of another person's existence on this planet. That there is a comfort in saying that it was just a routine, regular exercise of police force, that it's just the crumbling infrastructure of our prison systems, that it's just the hyper-violence or the drugs that we have in our communities, and not taking on both the individual and the societal responsibility to end these acts. It is placing it back on the victims and the victims' families to have to prove that there is a worthiness for their story to be heard. Institutionalized racism pops up in the ways that language gets changed and watered down. so that lynching is not really lynching unless it has a certain level of force involved, and there has to be a burden of proof that has to be brought to bear within this. Some of the largest decisions that have been made within our Supreme Courts, both on the federal and on the state level, are so insidious in the ways that they continually roll back the ability for people to actually seek and access justice. The fact that our law enforcement and our legal community are able to act with almost complete impunity on the crimes that they will commit, the violence that they may enact, the decisions that they make, that there is always a prosecutorial discretion that we're going to allow, and that they have a certain immunity based on those decisions. The fact that police can say, that any police lawyer can come forth and say, well, you know, it was reasonable. Any other officer in this situation might have reasonably acted in the ways that they did. The fact that someone can be even jailed, wrongfully imprisoned, and that anyone from the jurors to the judge can feel comfortable saying, we'll give you $20,000 for ruining your life for the last 3, 5, 10 years. I hope that's sufficient. Tells you so much about how we don't want to own the accountability that we have that's baked into. It's supposed to be part of that promise, that social contract that we are choosing to continually spit in the face of.
Yep. Wow. Yeah, that is powerful, Kiah. And I think, you know, one of the things that's sitting with me right now is just this complete dehumanizing that takes place of individuals that are in these environments and that are in these settings. So thank you for that. You know, I would love for you to tell us and for you to share with us about your early childhood and your teen days and how you experienced racism during that time.
So, you know, racism comes up in lots of ways throughout any person's childhood, and you know, raised by a single mom with 2 other siblings, all girls, whole woman family there, and being born into poverty, living most of my childhood within poverty, living in communities that were both very diverse and very white. You see and you oscillate through it. You learn how to survive those different mechanisms and those different points in your life. So there'll be a touch point, there'll be a moment where you remember, oh yeah, that person's father used to call me the N-word and had no problems about saying those sorts of things, but was totally fine with me spending the night with their daughter, staying overnight for a sleepover. Recognizing that, you know, teachers might touch your hair to try to understand you better, or many incidences within classroom settings, many instances within classroom settings that always kind of let you know that you are the other. I'd say one of the most powerful kind of moments that I had, there was one that took place within the first high school I attended. I attended 2 schools, one in the suburbs of Chicago and then one in the south side of Chicago. So in the first part of my high school experience, I remember we were hosting some events. There was a Black club that was hosting events to try to bring awareness for Black History Month, and had created entire performances, dance performances, play productions, and the interactions between the school security and the Black students, the level of financial support and even faculty support to putting those events on was very different than what I saw in many other spaces with other groups and other clubs. And I remember us being policed in the hallways and just really just being furious about that treatment. And I remember one of the security guards, and I was complaining to him, being like, why are you constantly giving us grief when there are white kids screaming down the hallway doing all kinds of crazy stuff all day long? But you're giving us grief as we're trying to actually participate in an after-school activity. And he said, well, but you're one of the good ones, so it doesn't really matter. It doesn't apply to you. And I remember writing a whole op-ed for our school newspaper and having the language edited down so that it was less critical, because they didn't want it to be defamatory towards school, even though what I was saying was true. Hit me in a different way, even though it wasn't targeted at me, And then I'll pivot to a little bit later in my high school years, which there's another really key moment. Well, actually, this is all at the same school. Remembering very clearly that there was a holiday season. We came to Christmas time, and the decision was made by the school administration that they weren't going to place a Christmas tree on top of the school as they normally would, because they said it's, you know, again, we're reifying white supremacy culture and, you know, amplifying Christianity over all other faiths. And so they were going to have a unity tree instead. And so in response, the white students got up in mass, hundreds of them in mass, got up and protested, walked out the door, went to the sister school, stole the Christmas tree off of their tree and came back. And they still to this day sit there and rah, rah. Remember when we did that? Not realizing that at the same time, while that was taking place, that gave us whole license for an entire wave of anti-Semitism to take place in that community. The synagogue got tagged with swastikas. Jewish teachers in the school had epithets thrown at them on a regular basis, and seeing this embarrassment of being like, you all can't rise up for something for real, but you're going to sit so heavy in your white privilege that you think that this is the appropriate act to take in that moment. And that was really kind of frightening to see how alone one might be when trying to fight back against these systems. And these are going to be the next leaders of the United States. These are going to be the people that are going to run your companies, and they're going to get into your government systems, and they're going to do all this great stuff. These are the next generation. And that's where their minds are at, because they have been so built into this institutional way of thinking of when we're thinking again around this institutional racism about who counts and who does not count. In those early days, it was very clear, and those lines were very clearly drawn. Now, what's really powerful about this moment was I was in high school during the Rodney King verdict when that came out, and when we saw the riots happen in LA. And I remember being so disgusted and furious at the verdict that came out, that I actually chose to not speak for the entire day. And I carried a note with myself everywhere I went to say, I don't know what I'm going to say to you. I'm going to be quite honest. I have white friends and allies, and I might not say the right things to you in this moment, because my heart is so broken and I am so angry that I'm going to hold you accountable for what these other folks did. And so I chose silence in that moment. And it's only now in reflection as an adult that I realize that that was a mistake. I was swallowing my pain for the comfort of the white folks in the room. I was limiting a conversation that needed to happen within those classrooms, within my peer groups, within the faculty and the administration there, to wrestle with that moment, that it wasn't just about the uprisings that were happening in LA, but it was about a much deeper moment in our country's history where we were realizing the fullness of what white supremacy can do to a body, where you cannot even get a day in court and be judged by a jury of your peers, an all-white jury in Simi Valley. Stop. Mm-hmm. So this was that space where I was starting to really feel and recognize this, but not knowing, not having the supports that I needed to fully step into that work. And then the contrast that I had from then going to Kenwood Academy on the South Side and being surrounded by beautiful brown and black people, but still having white friends who were also into and understanding and coming into their own understanding of the struggle, because they could see a world that was not so myopic. They could see a world that was more diverse. They could themselves be that poor person that didn't have the lunch money. Or they could have a black peer who was living in a mansion. They could see the fullness of everything that we're experiencing in this life, in that moment. And recognizing how we were able to stand in our truths was so key. So it really, there was so much. I feel fortunate for having had, you know, as some people say, these multiple lives, right? Where you get these opportunities to reflect. And now where I sit today, it makes it that much easier for me to talk to the youth. And even especially where I live here in Vermont, which is the second whitest state. Maine beat us out by about that much, but we'll see what happens with the next census, right? Finding those youth and saying to them, I know what your experience is like of being one of a few, but then also seeing the power of those youth in recognizing that, yeah, it was a Vermont school, Montpelier High School, that was the first to raise the Black Lives Matter flag in the entire country. for any pre-K high school through 12. So that's the work we've got to do. So that's how I reflect on my youth and where it brings me to this moment to talk about racism in some really difficult and brutal ways.
Yes. Yes, and I know your mission and I know your work in the world is to make an impact in this country politically. And hearing you talk now, I feel like I can see how that also was in your high school days. When did you first know that you wanted to enter politics? And did your childhood experience shape that for you?
I will say I had no interest in politics before I got into politics, none whatsoever. I engaged in politics. I helped work on some campaigns. I did work at the polls, but seeing myself as a candidate was not something I was interested in. It's, again, interesting, and I want to come back to this as we start to talk a little bit more about what's going on with our experience with law enforcement right now and with the criminal justice system. But I can say that for myself, I had multiple people ask me at many different points to say, would you consider running for office? And it always seemed like a space that wasn't right for me. I have opinions. I don't get starstruck. I'm not really that great about following conventions. I see the vitriol and I see that anger that comes. I see that oppression that is so heavy within those spaces. And I said, how can I see myself surviving within that? How can I see myself thriving and functioning and getting what I need to get done? I had so many people, again, coming to me and saying, consider it. And I said, I'm good. And then I happened to be in a program, which is where I actually met you, Jessica. Yep. Through the Impact Center based out of Washington, D.C. And we, just in case you don't know, we were part of a cohort of women that were selected and determined that we're going to be shaping the nation, shaping the future of our nation. And so this powerful cohort of women, we went through an entire journey of understanding what that means for us to be leaders and for us to step into our authentic selves as leaders. And these are great catchphrases that many people will charge you thousands of dollars to learn about. Right? This is how we can speak about ourselves. Can we speak of authenticity, right? The realness that we were needing required also an honesty and an ability to speak to our pain. And I was going through the process of doing a vision board and talking about the work that I was doing in my community. And it was really powerful and beautiful. But then I also, in entering this program, had just found out that I was going to be laid off. Now, mind you, this is at a hospital, a regional hospital, where there were a total of 3 women that were ever close to the C-suite of a hospital administration, myself and 2 Black female doctors. And within that 1 year, all 3 of us were gone. And I was the second to go. The third left because she saw what happened to the first 2 of us. Wow. Okay. Those Ivy League educated Black women that were decided to make the small rural white community their home and could not find their place within this community. And so here I was crushed. Here I was completely crushed after all of this great community programs that I have built with my hands and with other folks to really raise up the public health and the community engagement to get the hospital off the hill, that whole piece. And it was all gonna just be brushed away because I was determined to be non-essential, and those were just dollars and cents. It was not a worthwhile investment to keep that strong voice, to keep that passion for community within the halls of that building. And in that group, I sat there and expressed that pain. I expressed that real fear of the fact that I didn't know what the future was going to hold for me because I hadn't even found employment. And at that time, one of our mentors was like, look, when I hear you talk about the things that are happening in your workplace, you change. There's a sadness about you that I can feel. It's very real. It's palatable. Your voice drops. Your shoulders slump. But when you talk about your community and the work that you're doing within your community, there is a passion and a fire that should not be extinguished. It's a complete change in your countenance. It's a complete change in your entire being. Have you considered running for office? And of course, I'm surrounded by amazing people like Jessica who are like, yeah, go for it. What can we do do for you? How can we make it happen? I'm like, that's cute. That's for other people. I'm about to get on food stamps. I don't even have a job. Like, that's something folks leisurely do when you're rich and white and retired. Like, that's not something that I can even access. What does that even mean for me in my real life? I got a small child. I got a full-time job. Like, what is that world? But I was encouraged and I was buoyed by so many of these strong, amazing women. And I was buoyed by my community and stepped into electoral politics and had a difficult race, a crowded race, and I came out on top. And what that had taught me as I was going through that electoral process, and I'm just telling you about this candidate journey because I think it is really key, was one of the most beautiful parts of this whole experience was going door to door and connecting up directly with people and hearing their stories and us finding the similarities in our experiences. And me coming as a Black woman who knows what it's like to have to live on food stamps and have to be on Medicaid and have to get all of these special WIC and all these things from my child, who knew what that was like to live in public housing, who knows what all of those experiences feel like, being pushed and pulled in and out of the margins and into center and back out again. Someone who knows what those experiences were like, that resonated so heavily with the people that put me in office. And you cannot sidestep that experience, and you cannot sidestep that direct representation, not through proxy. And as much as I love so many of our advocacy organizations that are out there on the streets fighting, if they are not in those seats making those decisions, asking those critical questions, then what are we going to do? Right? How are we going to actually change things? So, yeah. So thinking about what that meant for me stepping into that politics was never something I imagined, but it was something that I was so glad that I had the opportunity to do. And I'm thrilled to be able to help other people step into that space as well and see that they do belong. They absolutely belong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love hearing you tell the story in that way. And I do remember that time together, and it was, and I remember when I saw that you were elected, it was amazing to see that. I saw a post or an article someplace, and it was so incredibly thrilling to see that. So you left office, public office, and the reason why you left has been widely covered by the media. Could you tell us why you made the decision to ultimately leave and resign, and how this impacted the way you support other underrepresented voices who want to run for office?
I appreciate that. What I came to realize, if you can see my dog, he's looking at me with so much love right now. That's why I ran because of my dog now. I want to spend more time with my dog. That was really why I left. It was part of it. It was a little part of it. So why I left, yes, there was this entire climate and entire environment of racial harassment and a lack of safety that is still in existence today. And it was realizing that when I had stepped into office, it was sort of the first time in a long time that Vermont had to come to grips with the fact that it was thoroughly unprepared for this new world order where white supremacy is reigning. It's reigning. It's popularized. It's sitting in the White House. And that militias and groups that are seeking to uphold white supremacy and even endorse genocide are like amongst us.
Flourishing.
And it was so much to say, as a state, we didn't have the systems that were necessary on a baseline security thing, like baseline security, some of the most fundamental aspects of thinking about what security might mean. And that's not saying that elected officials are somehow better than the general public and deserve more security and protection than the general public. But I wasn't even able to access security on a level of even what you would expect in the general populace. So if I could not get this as a highly visible, as one of the most visible and powerful people of color in the entire state of Vermont, what does that mean for everyone else? And recognizing that our judicial system is so faulty that you cannot get justice. You cannot utilize the system. And it's not always about creating greater criminality. It's supposed to be about bringing a balance of power and justice. It's supposed to be about recognizing a person's humanity. And it's about those systems that are using the moniker of public safety to actually ensure that they are doing that actual work. And I came to realize how quickly those things were not available, how much they were actually worked in opposition to, that there were actual efforts to try and undermine any of the concerns that I were raising, as well as criminalize me. Yeah, even within our own law enforcement department and our judicial department down here, our prosecution in my community, we're on a concerted effort to try to criminalize me for speaking my truths. That leaves no space for anyone to say, I don't feel a need to martyr myself. What I feel a need to do is to hit the streets and change the system, because no one else should have to experience this. No one else should have to experience this. So once we move beyond the physical, what are we doing as communities, as political parties even, as an entire system that's looking to build up movement, politics, and political power? Are those systems ready to support marginalized folks who will be the future targets of these entities, these systems, these organizations that have already declared us other and do not want us there, and will work in great collaboration to make sure that we are pushed out, forced out, or killed? Those things were not there. And I could not continue to carry on as though they would be. I could not wait to see whether or not we were going to catch up. I could not wait to see whether or not the State House was going to get us a metal detector. I couldn't wait to see whether or not my political party was going to be able to be ready with counter messaging as I'm being trolled and attacked. I could not wait to find out whether or not I would be given the financial supports that I need to build the physical security around my home, on my laptops and my computer systems, that I would even be given the support of staff to be able to best do my work, because, you know, there's so much more that you're dealing with other than just the work directly in front of you. And we aren't supported in those ways. And so at the end of my entire arc of history of this entire story, and I hit that critical moment, it became clear that my best move would be to move out of that space, but to work like hell to make sure that there is a pathway for the next folks, and there's somebody with their eyes and ears on this, so that if they choose to step into that space, they will be supported. So that's what I'm all about today.
I mean, it's amazing. Your story is just, it's so powerful, because, and that'll, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, and I would love to hear your thoughts. And Jared, I know you share your story very publicly, but I mean, it was at the point where you didn't know if someone could be in your home, you know, if you were being followed. You didn't know if someone could be listening in on your phone calls, you're on your computer, what you do on your computer. You're a mother, you're a wife. And so it was the feminine part of you and the feminine energy coming out with, you know, that motherly love and protection. But it was also like, oh my gosh, I have to protect my entire family, because there was so much going on. And so I'm just curious if you'd be willing to just share a little bit more about that, because at the end of the day, when because you were targeted, you were targeted physically, you were targeted online, you were cyberbullied online, basically because you were a Black woman who represented a very white community, and there was a small part of, I should say, there was part of that population that didn't feel good with that.
And that's important to know. So, I mean, while we can say, okay, there's this group, they're the troublemakers. We do that very often, right? We want to say that that's what we're seeking often through the criminal justice system, is we need a person to hold accountable rather than a community or a system to hold accountable for where those failures happened, right? And so for me, while recognizing that and we cannot keep asking for marginalized folks to step into these spaces at risk of their lives or their families' lives, at risk of having their information mined and re-put out there, to being doxxed. We cannot keep asking us to do this when we've been doing this for centuries. That has to end. For me, where the additional lack of sense of safety did come from the fact that there were people in power who were fine with minimizing. And again, saying, well, it's just those folks over there. What this moment's showing us, there's a meme out there right now that says, hey, there's a great app to help you figure out who are the racists that you know. It's called Facebook, right? Okay, so we're seeing very, very quickly and very openly where folks stand on understanding historical oppression and racism. We're understanding, we're seeing that very clearly, that while people may have held these beliefs quietly, they were always sort of rooting for Donald Trump to do these things. They were always sort of rooting for the cops to do these things. They were always sort of rooting for these criminal justice systems to continue to criminalize Black bodies. They were always sort of rooting for oppression to win because they were buying into and invested into that continual marginalization because it benefits them. There are benefits. There is a cost-benefit analysis that takes place in everyone's mind, and there were benefits to saying, that's not our community. Our state is not that way. Look, we've done so many things. We were the first to pass marriage equality. We were one of the first to ban slavery. And that somehow washes clean the fact that we have multiple points of intersection of when these oppressions are hitting, crushing, and destroying people's lives every single day. It is not 100 years ago. It's not 30 years ago. It's probably 30 seconds ago.
Yeah. And what I also think is so powerful is that, you know, we right now, what is part of the vernacular and what we're talking about in the media is police violence, but the response the police had to you when you went to them asking for help.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it's like, here you are, you know, you're a visible Black woman who is being targeted. There's evidence to show that. And the response from the police was also just, I mean, it was upsetting. And so would you mind just sharing a little bit about that as well? Because I think it's also to provide this different perspective that, you know, what's going on right now, this kind of conversation around law enforcement, it's right now, most people are looking at it as excessive force, but it's about just really, again, supporting all of the community, all of the communities, plural, that they serve, and taking all of the concerns seriously.
One of the things that came out of my whole story, I think that's important to know, is an amplification of introspection, I think, in many communities throughout the state. People had to start asking these questions. So what do racial disparities look like in our communities? Are we seeing disparate treatment between marginalized folks and those in the dominant culture? Is this Kiah incident an isolated incident, or is this part of an entire system, an entire environment? And what we are fully realizing and seeing and experiencing all across the nation is that my story is that of millions. It was to speak with regards to my direct experience with law enforcement. It's hard to do so without acknowledging the fact that within our state, we have the highest rates of Black males incarcerated in the United States. It is hard to say this, speak about my story without acknowledging the fact that there are no persons of color in the higher courts sitting on a judicial bench. They're only in the lower courts. And I think there's like one, maybe two, but I think one for sure. It is impossible to, and I don't know how many prosecutors we actually have. I don't think we have any prosecutors in my state that are persons of color. Maybe on assistant level, but none that are the lead prosecutors. It's an entire system that's allowed itself to continually create harms against people of color. And in our own community, we had an assessment done by the International Associations of Chiefs of Police to look at the practices and the policies of our local law enforcement to see what would be the results. What is really happening here? Kiah's story has given us an opportunity to do a look back and a look out. And what they found is that many people of color, many marginalized folks were literally afraid to even engage with that assessment process out of a fear of retribution. Because there already had been a system of putting people in prison wrongfully. There already had been a system of over-policing. There already had been a system of denying and erasing acts of racial hatred that had happened within our community. It's always we need to keep it under control and we need to control the narrative. So my narrative went international, and that's not something that they appreciated. It's not something that they appreciated at all. But it went international because, again, it's universal. And it's just a really glaring example. And again, I was a private citizen, even though I was in a public space. And so those same rights that should have been afforded to me in taking care and in dealing with my case, and not in minimizing, not in hiding evidence, not in redoing reports, not in withholding evidence, all of those things should never have happened to anyone, let alone to someone who was an elected official. So it lets you know very clearly, as somebody who is a person of color, LGBTQIA, from the disability community, someone who may have mental health challenges, if you're poor or working poor, visibly poor, recognizing that that system is going to continue to harass you and continue to criminalize your very existence. And that is ultimately what we saw, what happened with me. So even though things were happening to me, I was being set up and trying to be positioned by our town government, our town manager, our chief of police, our prosecutor, to be criminalized for my very existence and for speaking to that existence. Yeah,
I mean, you're a public figure. You're a public figure, and this is what was happening to you. And it's just incredible. It really is. I just saw some comments in the chat. So, okay, welcome everyone who's now joining. Thank you for being here. Yes, Eileen, thank you. This conversation is important and it's very layered. Yeah, thank you. So it's, Kiah has just such a powerful story, and she's done so much work on this issue. And even before you left office, I know that you put some emotions through before you left, because you're like, we're gonna do something here, because you knew that if you didn't do something, that it just wasn't gonna get done. Do you want to just share a little bit about that?
I mean, it was really early on. I stepped right in. I think on my second day in office, I was already calling out the governor, and I wasn't trying to do it to be like, I need to call out the governor, but I was like, I'm here to hold accountability, and what he just said was complete crap. So I have to just I gotta break convention, party convention, and challenge the very person that's holding that seat of power, recognizing again that we are on this top tier system that's meant to concentrate power at the top and everybody else gets little crumbs at the bottom, instead of an egalitarian system that allows for true and pure communication. I was able to put forth a lot of really amazing bills, and I was incredibly successful. And the only bills that I brought to the floor that didn't pass was one that the governor vetoed. And that was one that I'm still getting lovey eyes from my dog, y'all. I don't even know what to say, man. Like he's loving mama in her zone, I guess. It's really sweet. It's giving me life right now. My son's with a friend, just so you know. It's not that my son's not giving me life, but my dog's here in this moment. So he's feeling that energy from all y'all. So thank you. Where I was going with that was to say that I had an opportunity to really pass forth some really comprehensive bills, but they were not by themselves. It was advocates bringing these bills forth, but it was me also being able to utilize what I had access to. I had a voice, I had a microphone, I had an ability to talk and negotiate with other people around making sure that those bills would get through. And some of them still were watered down. This is what we talk about, that institutionalized racism within policymaking. So we were able to establish things like the first ever director of racial equity within the state government. So it's a cabinet level position that's actually tasked with doing this really high level work within systems of government, within state government, to root out racism as it sits. That's one person who is unstaffed, right? They don't have a minuscule budget and no additional staff to help them with that work. We were able to pass comprehensive pre-K through 12 ethnic and social equity in schools and being able to do that work. However, that work is still considered in an advisory capacity because the system did not want to allow for the people, even though they were very clearly stating this is what we want, to actually implement the changes that they have determined are necessary for our true liberation. So it was all of this kind of crazy stuff that you're constantly pushing and pulling from. So while we're making these historic strides, there's much, much that's lost. Within that also is important to know, there's both the questions around urgency and that's built into our bureaucracy, and also that we're supposed to accept small measures. I'm sorry, there's a lot going on at the moment, and I apologize if I'm cutting out.
That's okay. No, I also just want to make sure that everyone's muted. Zoe, can we just make sure everyone's muted? I feel like there's some extra noise coming in, so we just want to make sure that's the case. Okay.
Stop.
Yeah, I just want to read a few questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, if you're ready. New England is a strange place to navigate. My mother's father was the first Black judge in New Hampshire. He was appointed in the 60s. The first racial slur I ever was being called a dirty penny in a town that had less than 20,000 in the 2000 in the 70s. Kudos for your making your mark in Vermont. And thank you for sharing your experiences and truths. We love your dog too.
Yeah, so yes, thank you so much, Zoe. And Kiah, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but there are some beautiful comments that are coming in, and just also it is good to give voice to that, and just want to make sure that you actually hear that right now.
Thank you, I appreciate that very much. I mean, to let you know, I mean, the ways that I experienced race within my role there is not that terribly different than what you might experience within the workplace, within many workplaces, especially if they're predominantly white spaces. But even in spaces of color, we've been so institutionalized and so colonialized in the ways that we consider efficiency, the ways that we consider productivity, the ways that we consider voice and equality. And often it's around a tokenism, but it's not really around, we're trying to actually build in the work that you want to see get done that's necessary for us to transform the systems that we're up against. I had racial epithets that I experienced on the campaign trail. I didn't experience them directly from colleagues. However, there were some of the worst dog whistles and racist speeches that you could imagine that people came up with in those spaces, and even in their treatment of constituents that came in for a variety of experiences at the State House. And again, it was this constant reification that who belongs and who does not belong, and a system and a community, even within that legislative body, that was not rehearsed or practiced at knowing how to call those things out, how to see them, and how to change them and transform them, and letting them know that that those are unacceptable, and that is contrary to the work that we are trying to do and that we are supposed to be there to do. Those things just were not there in the ways that they needed to be when I was there. They've changed since, but it took me leaving in order for people to feel the necessity for that work.
Yeah, and I know a good part of the work that you do now is also not just supporting the state of Vermont specifically with building community around important policies, but also helping underrepresented voices be able to feel confident and comfortable actually running for office after your experience was so public. I want to share that Kirby, thank you for your comment here, saying that Kiah's story shook and rattled the Vermont military as well.
Hi, Kirby. So. Thank you. I was really fortunate to have an opportunity to speak to our members of the National Guard, the Vermont National Guard, and really supporting their Black History Month events and experiences and their learnings. And yeah, it's up and down. I mean, again, we think of these systems as people that are in power, or we think of them as kind of these monoliths, but they're citizens, they're individuals that are in each of these spaces. And so it's necessary for us to build out equity so that it flows in all aspects of our lives. And so whether you choose to serve or whether you choose to survive, we want to make sure that you're able to do so in a way that's nurturing, thriving, and healing for you to stand in yourself in those spaces.
Definitely. Yeah, and so while we're on this topic, there is a question in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that to you now, and then we'll go on to some of the other questions. So right now we're at 30 minutes, we have 30 minutes left, so we're an hour in. And we still have so much to talk about. So, but I do want to give voice to the questions that you all are offering up in your comments. So thank you so much. This engagement and this conversation is not just myself and Kiah, it's all of us together. So the question from Katie, thank you. In those government entities where the racism isn't blatant, i.e. where there are diversity officers or laws that protect minorities, how can we recognize and then challenge the institutionalized racism in order to help change?
So that's a great question. You have to do it on a consistent basis. You have to build. I say this a lot, but it's just because I had, previous life, past life when working in fitness, but your brain is a muscle, your heart is a muscle, and you need to build muscle memory around recognizing and seeing and calling those things out. When you are they come in very subtle ways. They can come in ways from how we think about a job application, how it's written up as to whether or not it is exclusionary or discriminatory. If it is, we have ways of seeing and hearing these things. What's happening in this moment, and that is so powerful, is folks that have felt like they needed to remain quiet are speaking with clarity, and they're speaking with their whole heart right now. We need to continue to support that and not get back into our lovely space of politeness protocols, which is something that we do a lot. We're like, well, for respectability, we must, for decorum, to be able to have civil conversations, we have to act and engage in particular ways that will continually silence out voices that are needed. We are needing to, we're needing to better, I apologize. There's lots of distractions happening around me. So we need to better focus on that work that we are trying to get across and ensuring that it is not leaving people behind. Because we also get into these spaces where they say, we're going to hire a diversity officer, we're going to put in a fair and impartial policing policy, we're going to have a new set of standards that we'll use to address inequities in the workplace. But they often are not driven by, designed by, informed by the people that are most impacted from those policies. So they are always short-sighted. So if you are stepping into these spaces, if you're in a room and you are not seeing the faces that are needed to be there, call that out and feel free to stop progress to ensure that the right work is done, because you're just wasting time otherwise. It is part of white supremacy culture to say we have to move forward, but we got to do it and we got to do it fast. Doing it fast is not always doing it right. And in most communities that have been marginalized and been pushed out, we have to rebuild trust. There's a trust that has to happen in order for that work to have meaning, and that takes time. That also takes being willing to shut up and to listen, but also acknowledging and holding that if people don't want to talk, if that pain is too great, that they should be allowed to do so and take cues from that silence. Don't see that as just acquiescence or as acceptance, but understand that there's much, much more behind that silence. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Great, thank you, thank you. And Zoe, I recognize that you're ready to go and ask that question. So, but I see that we have a couple of questions going into the Q&A, so we'll come back to those questions and we'll probably in about 15 minutes. So right now, and I also just want to state that we're having an honest conversation. This is a safe space. No one's here to say anything bad about law enforcement. Many of you know I have a twin sister in law enforcement, but part of the change that has to occur is all of us having honest conversations. And I think that, at least I know from my own experience, that has been what's been really helpful and impactful for me over the last 2 weeks, is having honest conversations about the Black experience in this country. And that's what this conversation is. So what historical facts tell us, your story tells us the near story, you know, took place a couple of years ago, that racism is a longstanding part of history in this country. So why is it that you think in particular that the death of George Floyd caused such outrage, specifically also by white individuals, you know?
Unfortunately, it takes for most that are in the majority culture to see our pain in order for them to acknowledge that it's real. So people of color have been screaming about the deadly lethality of systemic racism for centuries, with very little movement. And what is always shown, and that's part of how white supremacy culture works, is it requires that we have to visibly show our pain. You have to visibly see the scars. You have to visibly watch someone be harassed. You have to visibly see these things and bear witness to it in order for it to be real. And here was a situation, much like what we had in so many others of these, where we're being shown really clearly what is actually happening, but finding an easy off-ramp to dealing with it. And so here we are in the precipice of another presidential election, and people are caught up in their feelings about so much of what's been happening. We've got kids in cages right now. We have Black and brown youth in detention centers. They've started off in school, being policed in school, and now here they are in prison. And yet it took this totally egregious death of seeing someone almost delighting in this act, seeing how helpless everyone else felt in that moment, that while we've been trying to break down that bystander mentality that watches these things happen, but does not act, recognizing how vulnerable we all are in that moment. It's something that resonates all the way across, but it shouldn't have had to take that. But it is, and it's here, so we need to move on it.
Yep, definitely, without a doubt, without a doubt. You know, so not all states break down statistics in terms of race. So I know that's also been part of the conversation right now, is that there just needs to be more statistics. However, what we do know right now, if we just look at the last couple of months, is that 100,000 people died from COVID-19. We know that a big portion of that are part of, we're in the African-American community. I believe in Louisiana alone, 70% of people that passed away were African-American. What we know is that this continues to raise concerns around healthcare in the United States, but also particularly for people of color and for the Black community. We know that with the economic impact of this, that 44% of Black Americans, according to Pew Research, lost a job, or someone in their household lost a job during this time. 40%, I saw the statistics someplace, that 40% of Black business owners lost their business during this time. And many Black business owners were impacted by PPP, meaning they were not able to get the funding that they needed in order to revive their businesses. They just weren't able to have access to it. And there still really aren't any real like tangible statistics around it. This is why I'm not giving any statistics. So when you think about the confluence of high rates of COVID, in the Black community, the economic disparity, the healthcare disparity, and then you add on just the racism, which is the hum in the everyday life, that impacts, again, psychological security, spiritual security, just the ability to thrive in everyday life. You know, what is the confluence of all of this right now within the Black community?
It's the manifestation of the heartbreak we've been carrying since the promise of the American dream was placed in front of us as a falsehood. This is the reality that the systems that we believe are accessible are not. This is the reality that the resources that we've placed, the importance that we've placed still is around building, supporting, and maintaining the infrastructures that already have privilege. It's maintaining that privilege. I was not surprised in the difficulties that we've had around increasing public health awareness and getting testing that was needed, having so many members of our communities of color that are the frontline workers. They're the essential workers at the moment that have had to work retail, that have had to work in the service industry, the ones that are working in our fields, doing our farming, and they are given no real protections in this moment. And they're told by their states, they're told by their municipalities, they're told by their federal government that, again, it's about their labor, it's about the capital that they can produce. It is not about their humanity, it is not about their very lives that is of the most importance in this moment. And so it shows that, again, the solutions that were being touted that are supposed to be helping us to bend these curves and to slow down the spreads, these things that were supposed to be shoring up and supporting our economic systems, were never built with us in mind, or we would have been able to access them from the beginning. We know about the comorbidities of racism and the faults of our healthcare systems. And their failure to really provide healthcare in a comprehensive and meaningful way. We know that when Black folks go to the emergency room, that they're often, and Black and brown folks are often treated as though they're drug seeking instead of being given proper diagnoses. I have plenty of stories of my own life. I'm sure many on the call can share their own stories about things that have happened to them that are clearly showing that the healthcare system has not yielded in any way. I mean, many of the aspects of modern medicine that we have were built on our physical bodies, using us for testing for vaccinations, using us for medical procedures without anesthesia, using us as guinea pigs. Even in that moment where they said, well, we're going to go do all the vaccine testing in Michigan, that did not make me feel great to know that they were going to test on Black and brown folks in Detroit. Mm-hmm. We are not your guinea pigs, we are human beings. Right. And there's a default that happens within all this, that we are constantly the canary in the coal mine that's showing all of the cracks within our faulty system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, without a doubt. And as you say that, I was reminded by something I heard that in France, on French television, two healthcare workers, I think they were doctors and administration. Yes, Henrietta Lacks, thank you, Manaz, yes. Mm-hmm. And this was in France at the beginning of COVID, said, oh, we should just go to Africa and we should start mm-hmm. testing the vaccine. And it was like, what? Of course, mm-hmm. there was like outrage about that comment, mm-hmm. but it just flows so easily. It just, there's just no second guessing any comment, with something like that. No. But, you think about Germany, mm-hmm. South Africa, Rwanda, just to name a few, that have had forms of reconciliation, which has allowed somewhat for a peaceful coexistence. In many ways, systemic and really institutionalized racism has enabled global hegemony of the United States as a world power, right? So could the U.S. consistent defiance on reconciliation of their own citizens and with their own citizens actually one of the catalysts that ends their global hegemonic power in the world one day? And still so much needs to be done. I just also really want to reiterate that what we're talking about today in the media is police violence. And that's the main thing. But we are also talking about inequalities in housing, healthcare, education, hiring and promotion practices, environmental racism, the frequency and length of incarceration of Black individuals, economic and wage gaps, voting. I just heard on voting that there were issues in Georgia yesterday with voting, the Black LGBTQI plus community, and colorism, among others. Mm-hmm. There's just still so much left to happen. So just curious to know your thoughts on that. I mean, could this really impact the United States and their place in the world, and if they don't continue to take this seriously?
I would love to see a reconciliation happen. It's going to require for the masses to get engaged in this process and for it to not be managed by our government. The recognition of the fact that our Indigenous, our Native Americans, we've failed on every single treaty promise we've made. We did not uphold a single solitary piece that was supposed to give them the sovereignty and the humanity and the dignity that they deserved. We're still not getting our 40 acres and a mule. We're not even getting our access to justice. We're not getting access to economic mobility. We are not given the things that we were not given, fair and equitable education. Those things are not happening for us. And so we haven't even fixed that. We haven't even fixed what's happening within our Native populations here in the United States. So we got to fix that. We got to fix lives for Black folks. We got to fix lives for our refugee and populations. We got to fix lives. There are so many others that are going to be necessity to be brought into this movement, but it's going to take this white dominant culture to hold our government accountable for the things that they have promised and failed to deliver on, and the things that they are continuing to promise and will only partially ever grant. And that granting is still tenuous, and it is always retractable with a simple switch of who is in power, as we are seeing right now. So these things have not been given guarantees, and they have not been vanguarded in the ways that they need to be. I do want to honor that there are definitely some questions in the chat, and I see Zoe popping on to say some things too, so I want to give an opportunity. I'm so glad to be in this conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Talk a little about the underemployment of Black professionals with higher education, including graduate degrees. Many companies talk about diversity and inclusion, but they hesitate setting goals and reporting on KPIs on a regular and open basis.
So yeah, so the workplace is definitely a place where there are major issues, and all of the best efforts to try to bring about diversity are often just measures of tokenism. And even if there is a wide sweep, if there is not a systemic change, and looking really carefully at how that inequality began and has been maintained up to this point, if you don't do that look back on what are the actual components that are keeping folks from being able to get access to those places of power, to get into the C-suite, to be able to have mobility, then it's not going to be for, it will all be for naught. Data collection is important. I don't want to deify it though. Okay, because that's also part of white supremacy culture, that if I don't see it in a number, if you can't show me and it's not statistically significant, then it isn't significant. Data is also manipulable. It's interpretable by whomever needs to read it. And so it can be a marker, but it is not the answer. Some of the ways, there was a question, I think, in the chat that was asking around job postings. I'm going to go ahead and just answer it. Answering around job postings and thinking about the HR process. Here's a classic example for you. And this is something that I had to learn myself. Job applications are frequently very ableist. Very ableist. They may use jargony language. They place an emphasis on a level of perfection that is neither real nor sustainable for most folks. And they do not actually often ask the key questions around what do you actually need for this person to do this job and to do it well, and not just as a part of a machine, not just as one cog in the wheel. This is what I do, I make widgets, right? But what does this whole person come and bring into this actual work environment? And those questions are often framed in ways that continually set you back into history. If we don't have Ban the Box, where you're asking about people's criminal history, then you're bringing in a part of their past that may have very little to do with, as much as we want to place individual choices and decisions on that, as it could an entire system that has been set up to fail them and to place them in criminality. If we do not look at, for example, a simple thing that had never occurred to me before, when you're doing job interviews even, there's this often demand when we're thinking about who are leaders, it's based on a white male-centered idealism of power, right? So that person who's a leader is highly efficient and they're able to get their teams to do exactly what they need and they're strategic. They are not working with whole people. They are still working with entities, and they are still working with very specific constructs of who the people are that they're managing, right? So is that the lens of leadership that we want? And when we're thinking about in these job interview questions, like, what does leadership look like to you? And what are your plans for where you want to go? It's both a rote memorization of ideals and values that are not relevant across cultures, but it's also asking for a pop quiz kind of mechanism where you don't even get to see the questions in advance. So that individual doesn't have an opportunity to come into their full selves and might want an opportunity to reflect and really see and imagine themselves in that work. But instead, you're supposed to be able to come up with those answers on the fly. Please give me your 3-point plan on how you're going to fix our entire, third quarter that was low in this area. What would you do? Come on, that's not real. That's not real. And that's not what's necessary, but it's a way that you screen out. It's a way that you push out those who could belong. Everybody does typos. There's a reason why Grammarly is one of the most popular apps right now, okay? Because people struggle with grammar, they struggle with typos, they struggle with errors. Are those errors actually indicative of a person who is incapable of doing this work well? No. So I hope that gives a few of examples. I don't want to sell all my goods right now, but I think that might be, I know that that's a distinct area that a simple change can be rethought about what does that application look like and how does that happen? Is it just in written form? Can you do it in other ways? What might be meaningful for people from different experiences?
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. Yeah, and please continue to bring in questions. So, as we start to close and we have about 10 minutes left, is what suggestions do you have for allies in the movement? We've just had this in-depth conversation about the realities that Black America is facing. What can white allies do?
Right now, you can donate like crazy. Donate like crazy. We never got reparations. Donate like crazy to POC-led and marginalized groups that are doing this frontline work. We've learned how to do mutual aid. Mutual aid was a thing before it was popular, right? We learned how to do mutual aid through this COVID crisis. Utilize those same skill sets to reach out and connect up with your actual direct neighbors. Reach out to your communities. Reach out to your kids' classmates. Reach out to your local pastor. Reach out to the folks that we've kept as invisible too long. Recognize fully that there's a distinct opportunity right now to take the lead from people of color. But this is your work to do. It is our voices that are needing to be heard, but it is your work to do. And in order for us to do it, we need resources because we've been doing so much of this liberatory work for free, being grossly underpaid, not having health benefits as we needed to. And this is difficult, extractive work. Recognizing that the folks that are on the front lines are carrying not just the actual labor, but they're carrying the histories and the ancestral histories of their entire communities, their lineage, their experiences with them. And that is really exhausting. It is physically taxing. It is spiritually draining. And we need to be refilled and revived. I appreciated on a call we had today from the Movement for Black Lives that was talking about some of these white-led organizations. You're going to need to let your Black folks switch over to just doing this liberatory work for a while now. If you're really about this work, you can take them off of bookkeeping for a minute and have them go do the work that's part of their heart center, right? But we're going to pay them for that. We're not going to ask them to have to put their volunteer hours, their time away from their family, their time away from their healing and restoration to do the work that y'all should have been doing all along.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. And that's a beautiful segue into just this last question before we take a couple more questions and we leave. But, what does ancestral healing mean to you? And what steps would you suggest are taken to be able to help heal these communities going forward? And really spiritually, in community, with one another, however you see that.
The ancestral healing does come from, again, I think from this reconciliation. The healing comes from standing in true solidarity. And when I say solidarity, it's not just posting up on social media. And it is going to protests, that's part of it. Being visible, visibly placing your bodies on the line to protect others that are trying to speak up. The healing comes when we actually are seeing the changes that we've asked for and nothing less. The healing comes from not asking us to wait another day. It's just not a priority right now. We'll get there. If you're willing to take this concession, it's about not asking us to continually having to sacrifice parts of our whole selves for the larger movement, because the larger movement is all of us, and we all have a stake in collective liberation. The healing comes from us being able to reclaim our ancient knowledge, right? So we want to talk about ancestral healing. It's about claiming our ancient knowledge. Now, as much as we might want to say, okay, everybody go back to the land. Let's go back, let's go farm. Let's go live out on the countryside and let's learn how to garden. Let's learn how to cultivate. Let's learn how to build. When we have done that, we have been chased out. We have been killed. Our crops have been burned. Our land has been stolen through laws. When we try to come, you know, as many people of color will say, I wanted to come to Vermont because, you know, I want to have chickens in my backyard just like everybody else. We want to have chickens in our backyard, but we also don't want to have to deal with being faced with racism and fear of the people that we're trying to sell our eggs to. Experience those things. We want to be able to live in peace. And I'm seeing so many more people of color just doing an exit. exiting out of our urban centers, exiting away from these communities that have harmed them to try and find a place that will be quiet and will give them the peace and respite that they deserve. And so we should be able to have that everywhere. We should not have to place ourselves out in the sticks in order to have that peace. That's when that ancestral healing starts to happen. I want to encourage, if there's folks that are in the agricultural sector, you have land, there are reparations programs. There are Black folks and brown folks looking for land. We never got our 40 acres and a mule. You don't need all your land. It's going to be honest. There are very few farmers that have hundreds of acres of land that are using all 100 acres. You don't need all that land. Give that land to someone else to use, to cultivate and build their own business, to create their own food, to create their own systems. We will begin the ancestral healing when we see ourselves reflected in our schools, when we see ourselves, our histories, our stories, not just our struggles, not just the pains of slavery or the civil rights movement or the systems of oppression and those examples of oppression. We will feel that ancestral healing when we also see ourselves celebrated and recognize the multiple contributions that marginalized folks have made to create our societies. From so many things, from our inventors to our scientists, to our activists, to our philosophers, the things that we have brought into this world. When we see that, when our youth are able to see that and feel that, that's when some of the ancestral healing will happen. I think the dog agrees with me.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kiah. Zoe, do we have any other questions in the Q&A or the chat?
So yes, we have a fascinating point about job postings. Thank you. Can you say more about what we could, what could make a job posting exclusionary versus inclusive? So back on the same topic, but I don't think that.
I appreciate it. I had to get my dog to stop barking. I think someone's delivering a solidarity meal. That's really awesome. So, so the question was more around, I'm sorry, it was more around thinking about within the work environment, around what that means to building inequality around the work environment.
Yeah.
Was that the question? So I think also a really important piece is to recognize that there are many people of color that are able to do diversity trainings. There are many marginalized folks that are doing diversity trainings. You're gonna probably need to hire an expert. The likelihood that you have that institutional knowledge within your workplace may not be there. It is entirely possible. You might have a subject matter expert right there in the wings who's been waiting for their opportunity to do that work. I'm gonna love their work again because they're doing that work. So it is entirely possible that you'll have that there. I would say one of the most important things to do, and we talk about this a lot, is around storytelling, right? Our ability to tell our stories, our ability to step into telling our truths really has everything to do with these components of, I'm sorry, just one second. Sorry, I appreciate it. Sorry, dog's still going crazy because it was solidarity meals, which was really gorgeous. So I'm sorry. So hear from the people who actually are in those workplaces. Do some focus groups for those that are there, those people of color, those from marginalized populations, to find out what their true work experience is. Again, it's not all about data. A lot of it is more qualitative than it is quantitative. You need to hear what their experiences are like and what they would want to have those individuals shape that change that's going to happen within that workplace. So that's one of the most basic things that you can do, and many people skip that step. It's the same as any community work and change that we would want to do as well. It has to be driven, led, and brought into the dreams, the visions, the hopes, and the fears of the people who are most directly impacted. So those are things that I would say that are really, really crucial. And you'll get some truths that you would never get from just seeing whether or not there's an uptick in a particular demographic within your HR roster.
All right, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Kiah. And so it is 6:30. So just want to honor everyone's time and say thank you so much. I really hate to end abruptly, but what I do want to be honoring of everyone's time. There was one question in the chat, Kiah, that I saw too, where someone asked if you were available to speak to other groups as well. Kate asked this, so I don't know if you want to put your email in the chat so that people can connect with you. And so Kiah will do that. And so if you guys are interested in connecting with Kiah directly, please feel free to do that. She'll put her email in the chat. Also, we'll send out the replay of this so that you all have that as well. And I also would be happy to put Kiah's email into the email that we sent to you, so you all have that too. Really, it's just such a deep honor to have you here, Kiah, to share your story, to share your experience, your vision of the country and the work that you're presently doing now. It really is incredible. And just obviously this engagement, seeing the comments in the chat, obviously you have truly impacted everyone who was here as well. And I just honor all of you for coming in here today and for taking the time to listen. 90 minutes, a lot of webinars right now are 60 minutes, but thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I felt this story and everything that she's doing, it had to be 90 minutes. So I appreciate you staying with us for this length of time, and just so honor every single one of you. And then, of course, I want to thank Zoe, who is just incredibly a valued member of our team. I just appreciate you so much. So thank you so much. And Kiah, I'm going to throw it off to you. Do you have any last words for everyone as we just say goodbye tonight and just end?
Thank you so much for participating in this conversation. I know that these are hard truths, but I'm grateful that you're in this, and I hope that you will stay in this work. And thank you for supporting both of us. Thank you for supporting Black women.
Yes. Thank you.
Sure. Be safe out there, everyone.
Yes, definitely. Bye. Thank you. Take care. Zoe, are you still there?
Yeah, I am.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Okay, let's see. All right, so let's see. What I'm going to do, just one second. I'm just doing a couple things here to close out.